Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you to everybody here at Chautauqua for a really wonderful welcome. I've had a great time here this week and just really so much appreciate the hospitality, so thank you. One of the things that I've noticed in my time here is that Chautauqua is an old-fashioned kind of place. You still print a daily newspaper here. I saw yesterday, actually, that there was like a commemorative issue, I think, and I thought, are there 2 daily newspapers? I mean, that's crazy. And my guess is that a lot of people don't have TVs in their homes here. There aren't many cars. People play board games. And I kind of imagine that somewhere around here, there's a Western Union office if you need to send a telegram. Now, there's an old and very short joke about the classic Jewish telegram. And you may know what it is. It says, "Start worrying, details to follow." And for good reason. Over 3,000 years of existence, the Jewish people has experienced an exceptional amount of persecution. Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, the Syrian Greeks, the Romans, the Crusaders. We were expelled from England, we were expelled from Spain. We were subjected to pogroms in Eastern Europe, subjected to blood libels. We've been expelled from Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and other countries after 1948. And that's not even to mention the Holocaust. A few years ago, my wife and I were talking about buying an electric car. I really wanted to for environmental reasons and because long-term it's cheaper, turns out, the maintenance costs are lower. But she wouldn't do it. Why? The Holocaust, of course. If we have to get in the car and drive to Canada, she told me, I don't want to have to worry about finding a charging station. True story. My wife comes by that fear honestly. All 4 of her grandparents were survivors of persecution during World War II. Her father, Peter Blitt, was born in the Ukrainian forest in 1942 while his parents hid and battled the Nazis as partisans. If you've seen the movie Defiance, that's more or less their story. And at one point, the family was actually fleeing from the Nazis, and Peter is this baby, a few months old. It's the winter time, and you have a crying baby, and the Nazis are chasing you. And the baby won't stop crying. And if the Nazis find you, that's it. Your whole group is dead. So you're faced with a Sophie's choice, and they decided they had to leave the baby with the hope that miraculously he might survive and they could come back and get him. And a few hours later, they came back, and miraculously, he had survived. And all around him were boot prints in the snow. And somehow, maybe it was because some compassion was awakened, I'd like to believe that, or maybe it was just because the Nazis were just too cheap to use a bullet. They had decided not to kill him. He survived. His father, who was a bit of a badass, went and held up a Polish farmer who he knew in the area and said, you're going to take care of my child until the end of the war, and then we're going to get him back. And if you don't do that, we're going to kill your entire family. So he said yes. And 3 years later, they did come back for him. And they eventually made their way to a DP camp in Germany and to Calgary, Alberta, where he grew up. And my wife was born in Ottawa and grew up in Toronto. But you can imagine that kind of trauma, what that does to a family. And I didn't even talk about the son they had lost to the Nazis earlier. The trauma is very real. Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who has studied epigenetic and intergenerational trauma, has written about this, and I saw on the VA, the Veterans Administration website, they've been looking a lot into this work. And here's what they say: epigenetic processes alter the expression of a gene without producing changes in the DNA sequence and can be transmitted to the next generation. It literally gets into our genes. The epigenetic, that intergenerational trauma starts in one place, and it's on top of centuries and centuries and centuries of accumulated trauma that gets passed on. And I can testify from personal experience watching how this has affected my wife, how it's affected my own children, how depression and anxiety are very real, how after the 2016 election, we started asking ourselves, would we need to leave at some point? And that led to that conversation about not buying an electric car. So we have a hybrid. This is all to say that this is very, very real. That Jewish suffering is real, that epigenetic trauma and intergenerational trauma is very real. And don't worry, it's not just unique to the Jews, but we'll talk about that in a minute. As Michael mentioned, my day job, when I'm not here, actually while I'm here too, is I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. And IJS, as we call it, was founded in the late 1990s, largely in response to the phenomenon of Boo Jews, Jewish Buddhists. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, by the 1990s, you had tens of thousands of Jews who had grown up in Jewish communities, Jewish homes, and they didn't, for whatever reason, find what they were looking for spiritually in Jewish life. And they got to college, or they got someplace and they discovered transcendental meditation, or Zen, or Vipassana, or yoga. They discovered some kind of Asian practice, and what it seemed to do for a lot of people was heal some kind of trauma that they might not even have been aware of, but they found something healing, something really powerful in that practice. And our founders looked at that and they said, that's really wonderful that these folks found that, but it's a shame that they couldn't find it within our own tradition, because we have so many of these riches and tools within our own beautiful 3,000-year tradition of Judaism. And so for the last 25 years, that has been the work of our organization, to develop and teach Jewish spiritual practices that can help us heal, can help us sense interconnection, purpose, meaning. And before I worked at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, I worked at the University of Chicago. And there, as the Dean of Students, I worked with a wonderful dean named David Nierenberg. David is a world-class historian, and he's one of the very few people whose level of world-class intelligence is only matched by his level of world-class Menschlichkeit. He's a really, really good guy. And he was a wonderful partner and mentor for me. David is most famous for his 2013 book, Anti-Judaism, The Western Tradition. And what he shows is, in that book, and it gets trotted out every few years, sadly, is that the Western tradition was built on anti-Judaism. And he calls it anti-Judaism because anti-Semitism was a 19th century term, but anti-Judaism goes much further. Here's how he puts it. Anti-Judaism should not be understood as some archaic or irrational closet in the vast edifices of Western thought. It was rather one of the basic tools with which that edifice was constructed. More recently, this past February, Dara Horn, the novelist, wrote an article in the Atlantic that was widely circulated that was called "Why the Most Educated People in America Fall for Anti-Semitic Lies." And the first part of that article, she basically summarizes very well David Nierenberg's book. And here's how she puts it. If piety was a given society's ideal, Jews were impious blasphemers. But if secularism was the ideal, Jews were backwards pietists. If capitalism was evil, Jews were capitalists. But if communism was evil, Jews were communists. If nationalism was glorified, Jews were rootless cosmopolitans. But if nationalism was vilified, Jews were chauvinistic nationalists. Whatever a Western society decided needed to be other, this is me, not her, that was what it ascribed to the Jews. And in fact, today you have people who will be called Jews, or behavior that might be called Jewish, even though they're not actually Jews, right? But that's what the society needs to identify and call other. And so we can simultaneously, as many of us have been experiencing recently, be taking it, feeling it, both from the political right and from the political left. We can be feeling it from the capitalists and from the communists. We can be feeling it from the nationalists and the humanist internationalists. Dara Horn goes on to say, when one reads through Nirenberg's carefully assembled record of 23 centuries worth of intellectual leaders articulating their society's ideals by loudly rejecting whatever they considered Jewish, this deep neural groove in Western thought becomes difficult to dismiss, its patterns unmistakable. Anti-Semitism is, this is me again, is one of those deep burrowing sleeper traits in society that gets activated whenever things get charged. When there's economic inequality, when there's migration, when there are forces of instability, all things that we're feeling in spades today. Whenever those things happen, Jews wind up sending that telegram, worry now, details to follow, or as we say in the abbreviated version of grace at our holiday meals, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. The good news is that in the last couple of generations, of course, we've been working on this a lot. Right? Beginning in the 1960s, you had the interfaith and ecumenical dialogue movements. You had, as part of Vatican II, the Catholic Church adopting Nostra Aetate, revising its approach and its teachings about the Jews, and certainly many Protestant and Jewish dialogue groups have been working at this, but these are deep, deep patterns. They are structural and they go back 2,000 or more years. And so 2 generations is a good start, but we've got a long way to go. Now, the problem is that this isn't just a story that the West has been telling about us. It's also a story we've come to tell ourselves. For a long time, it's actually a source of Jewish humor, a lot of our humor, as I've already pointed out. I was an orchestra conductor in college. I was a music major. And to this day, I mean, though I don't conduct an orchestra anymore, maybe leading an organization is its own kind of orchestra conducting, but I go to the Chicago Symphony with my mom, and I'm still a big music fan, and I've enjoyed the music here. But my favorite TED Talk is this one you should really look up. It's a talk from, it's at least 10 years old, more than that, by an Israeli conductor named Itai Talgam, called Lead Like the Great Conductors. Maybe you've seen it. And he goes through various conductors, from Richard Strauss to Riccardo Muti. Ultimately, he ends up at Leonard Bernstein. And each of them is teaching a leadership lesson. It's a leadership style. It's a very clever talk. And there's one point at which he's showing a clip of Leonard Bernstein, who's conducting one of these beautiful, slow, agonizing passages in a Mahler symphony. And you can kind of imagine. And there's a look of pain on Bernstein's face. And Talgam explains why, and I'll say it with his accent. He says, because it's funnier if I say it this way. He says, because the meaning of the music is pain, and you're playing a painful sound, and you look at Lenny and he's suffering, but not in the way that you want to stop. It's suffering like enjoying himself in the Jewish way. So we make jokes about it, and it really is at least half of what makes up Jewish humor. But what Itai Talgam is saying, what Leonard Bernstein is saying, is that suffering is part of what it means to be Jewish, almost as though a large part of what it means to call ourselves a chosen people is that, yeah, we're chosen to suffer. 5 years ago, Rabbi Tirza Firestone, who's also a clinical psychologist, so Rabbi Dr. Tirza Firestone, published an amazing book, which I really, really encourage you to read, called Wounds into Wisdom, Healing Intergenerational Jewish Trauma. Wounds into Wisdom, Firestone. And what Tirza did was she interviewed, she did a lot of research specifically on Jews who had survived various forms of trauma. The story that prompts the book is that her own parents were Holocaust survivors, and ultimately, mutatis mutandis, that winds up, it results or contributes to her brother's death by suicide at age 30. Which opens up for her, takes her on a journey of what's going on here and what are the traumas that have been unprocessed, the stories that were untold in those families, but also even wider afield, not just Holocaust survivors, but Jews who fled Iran in 1979, people who had survived suicide bombings in Israel, other Jews who had survived specifically Jewish trauma. And she's very clear, while she's telling a story about Jews, she's also telling a story about human beings. Right, but she was locating it within the Jewish community. And here's what she had to say. She says, no matter what a Jew's ancestry or where Jews have hailed from, Jewish identity today is bound up with some facet of victimhood. Whether through family stories, media, education, or personal experience, Jewish victim identity comes to us via trauma images and sensory information deposited and carried in the bodies and minds of Jews everywhere. Without awareness, victimhood can become our central organizing principle. And I would argue that we have been exceptionally successful at doing just that. When you look at the Pew Center for Religions, Study of Religions surveys of the Jewish community, both in 2013 and 2020. And these are like the gold standard of research into the Jewish community. They asked a question in both of those surveys, and the results were similar, asking people to complete what's an essential part, or answer what is an essential part of being Jewish to them. Right? What's an essential part of being Jewish? And so you have things like leading an ethical and moral life, very high on the list, 72%. Working for justice and equality in society, 59%. Being intellectually curious, 56%. But number one on the list, at 76%, is remembering the Holocaust. We have been so successful in the last generation or two at building Jewish life around Holocaust remembrance that it is the number one thing that Jews in America think of when they say this is what it means to be a good Jew. Talk about a victim identity. And I'll say it goes even deeper than that. It goes way farther back than that. Every Passover, how many of you have been to a Passover Seder? So as part of the Haggadah, right, we have a line, a couple of different lines, but we have this one in particular, where we actually raise our glass to thank God for this. But wow, do we thank God? Okay. Shelo echad bilvad amad aleinu lechalotenu. Because it wasn't only one person who stood up to try to destroy us. Ella shebechol dor vador. But in every generation, they stand up, they rise up to destroy us. And the Holy Blessed One rescues us from their hands. All of this leads to hyperarousal. It leads to responding to real anti-Semitism in ways that aren't always the wisest or the healthiest. It leads, if we're not aware, as Tirza Firestone says, to continuing a cycle of intergenerational trauma. Now, I want to hasten to add, there is warranted hyperarousal because folks really are out to get us. I have been dreading all week giving this talk because I've been watching the news in the Middle East and I wasn't sure what the political context of this talk was going to be. There are folks who really are out to get us. There is genuine hatred, there is real evil, and we should not be Pollyannish. I am not arguing for Jews to turn the other cheek. I'm a rabbi, there are plenty of ministers here. We can have a theological conversation about that. But vigilance is important, and hypervigilance is dangerous. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, that's probably it. That vigilance is important and hypervigilance is dangerous. Our existence, our society, our individual and collective well-being lives in that zone between vigilance and hypervigilance. It's evocative to me of Ronald Reagan's line, trust but verify. Tirza Firestone goes on to say, quote, hyperarousal has indeed been warranted, but chronic vigilance born of Jewish history and integral to Jewish identity keeps people from seeing themselves or raising their children as truly safe members on this earth. Hyperarousal means being always on edge, on the periphery, vigilant for trouble, and reading signs of disaster on the horizon and in the tea leaves. Knowledge of history and the desire to survive demand this. The dual identity of other and chosen keeps the trauma narrative alive and active. So that's the problem. So what do we do about it? How do we change it? And I want to offer 3 potential approaches. The first is, I believe that we can tell more stories of Jewish pride, joy, celebration, and meaning. Sometimes when I'm speaking to groups, or when my colleagues and I are doing this work and we speak to groups, we actually invite people just to sit and ask themselves the question and then respond, what do you love about being Jewish? Because so often, we're carrying a whole lot of tension, but what do you love about being Jewish? And we'll take, a big sticky note and we'll write answers and we'll take down, and we can fill up pages and pages. People start gushing out things: survival, history, learning, Shabbat, the shofar, my bubby's matzah balls, Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, the Talmud, Isaiah, the land of Israel, the people of Israel, Hanukkah candles, remembering our ancestors, old Jews telling jokes, which is a wonderful Facebook channel, Challah, our holidays, our heritage, our commitment to ethics, Jewish music, Fiddler on the Roof, Doug Emhoff. That's a more recent one. In my job, I get a lot of emails. I think like a lot of nonprofit CEOs, I get a lot of cold call emails. Yeah, Michael's nodding his head. And they're very clever these days, right? They're like, Michael, just following up on my last email, are you interested in, and they're trying to sell you whatever, some donor software, some marketing something, this, that, or the other, right? And I feel like sometimes I spend half my day just deleting these emails. And most of the time that's what I do. But one time, a couple of years ago, in the fall, I got one of these emails, and I clicked on it for some reason, and it was, how would you like to have an NFL commercial for your nonprofit? A commercial on a National Football League broadcast. And I cracked up. Like the idea of a Jewish mindfulness organization, this spiritual thing. And what are we going to do on, Monday Night Football? It's not going to work. So I laughed at it. And then about 15 minutes later, it was nagging at me. I was like, huh. So I wrote back to the people. I said, is this for real? And they said, yep, it's for real. And I wound up on the phone with these guys. And it turns out, do you remember those in the airports, there were those CNN news TVs, and they went away a few years ago. They got bought out by a minority-owned business out of Florida that has a social mission, and they were making available extra ad time that they had bought up on their NFL broadcasts to nonprofits. And so we got on the phone, they said, so they're $5,000 a spot, and we've got, Seattle Children's Hospital and Sloan Kettering, and they're buying up 25. How would you like to buy 25? So I said, I don't really have an extra $250,000 lying around, and nor are the eyeballs on that ad eyeballs that really matter to me. But could I get one? Because the story I could tell, that we could tell, around what we would say on an NFL ad, that's worth $5,000. So sure enough, they said yes, and so we wound up making an ad. And that same year, you may remember in the Super Bowl, there were ads for countering anti-Semitism, standing up to Jewish hate, which is great. And Robert Kraft is doing important work, and that's great. And he should, if he wants to fund us, Robert, if you're listening, happy to talk. But we decided to make our ad about joy, about all the ways that Judaism and Jewish life are these things that contribute to your human flourishing. These make your life better. It's about community, and it's about tradition, and it's about ethics, and it's about depth. And how often, the story, why it was worth $5,000 was to say, nobody's telling that story. Every billboard that I see that's sponsored by a Jewish organization on a highway in Chicago is Stop Jewish Hate. But that also reinforces for Jews that that's what Jewish life is about, and that's not all that Jewish life is about. So we can tell different stories. We can change the kinds of stories that we tell. That's one. A second approach is, let me say, mindfulness can also help. And I want to be clear also, beyond that, therapy can definitely help. And that almost goes without saying, and that is a Jewish practice, of course. But mindfulness can also help. And in our organization at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, we talk about a very basic three-step process that you can kind of essentialize a lot of mindfulness down to. It comes down to being able to be self-aware, right? Can I be aware of what's happening in my body, in my mind, right? Can I then calm myself to create some space between stimulus and response? And then can I make a choice about how I want to show up and not have to show up just out of my reactivity, my fear, my anger, my anxiety? This is in line with, of course, what Viktor Frankl, the great Jewish psychotherapist and survivor of the Holocaust, said. The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So we can create more space, more time between stimulus and response. And that's something all of us can practice, and if you want to come to our live daily sit at 12:30 Eastern every day, just go to jewishspirituality.org. The third approach that I would offer is to expand our vocabulary and our understanding beyond merely the political and historical, but into the spiritual. So one of the things that we do at my organization is we teach a lot of Hasidic texts from the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement was founded in Eastern Europe in the 18th century. In fact, the founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, was born 7 years before Benjamin Franklin. So this is, in some ways answering similar questions to the Enlightenment. What do you do on a theological and practical level when power no longer is solely located in a king or an emperor, but all of us can embody divinity, right? It's located within all of us. And of course, that's also a question that Protestant theologians were asking too. And one of the things that Hasidic masters do so well is offer creative rereadings of texts. And so there's not a Hasidic master who actually teaches this one, but I'm going to, with a little bit of chutzpah, offer my own on that same passage from the Haggadah. It was not only one person, it was not only one moment. Shelo echad bilvad. It wasn't only in one moment, one single moment that arose, that made us feel that kol, the Hebrew word for everything, that all was lost, that we would perish. It wasn't only one moment that arose that made us feel that way. Rather, in every generation, those same forces arise to make us feel that sense that all is lost. Lechalotenu, kol, it's the same word, that all is lost. In every generation, those forces arise to make us feel that way. They lead us into a place of constriction. In Hebrew, the word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim literally means the place of narrowness, the place of constriction. They lead us into this place of constriction. But the Holy Blessed One offers us a path to spiritual and political liberation from their hands. To me, that's just as true a reading as the political historical reading, but it adds a spiritual dimension. And so it's not to say that we shouldn't think about the political and the historical, but we should also be thinking about the spiritual and experiencing that in our kishkas. The Torah actually, more often than anything else, reminds us that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, that we were oppressed. And it's actually the proof text for 36 of the 613 mitzvot, the 613 commandments that we count. The purpose of the Torah, it seems, in that way, is to help us awaken our compassion, to help us constantly be liberating ourselves and others from constriction from Egypt. We're commanded actually twice a day to remember the Exodus from Egypt. And the Exodus from Egypt didn't just happen then, 3,000 years ago, but it's ongoing all the time. Every time we are leaving that place of personal constriction or collective constriction, or of course when we're liberating, in a political sense, people, we're always liberating from Egypt, and we're doing God's work in that way. I want to close by sharing one small way all of this has played out in my own life, and how it might offer some seeds of healing and repair, not only for Jews, but for all of us who have suffered and do suffer from these deep embodied traumas of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. This is a story, I hope, about turning wounds into wisdom, is in the title of Tirza Firestone's book. Like so many other Jews, for me, the day of October 7th, 2023, aroused an enormous amount of pain and anguish, and I can tell you just saying that still arouses some of those feelings. That Saturday, that Shabbat, was also the final holiday of our fall holiday season, the holiday of Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly, which most people haven't heard of, but it's real. Because I don't use electronics, including my phone, on Shabbat and Jewish holidays, I had no idea of the news unfolding in Israel that morning. My 10-year-old son and I walked to synagogue, and I started to hear some whispers about an attack that had taken place. But frankly, there had been stabbing attacks and terrorists ramming cars into bus stops full of Jewish Israelis for years, and I thought it was yet another one of these terrible but not widespread events. Our synagogue's custodian, a wonderful non-Jewish man named Mark, had the news on in his office, and the rabbi went down to get updates. And about an hour into the service, he got up to share the news with everyone. Something truly horrible was taking place. A massive invasion of terrorists on Israel's border with Gaza, kibbutzim destroyed, hundreds of people murdered in their homes, hostages abducted to Gaza, cities taken over, army bases overrun, including the army base where one of my nieces had concluded her military service just a year before, and where my then 9-year-old son and I had actually been present for her going-away party. It was truly incomprehensible, and that was days and weeks before we learned the full extent of the atrocities and horrors of that day. We muddled through the rest of the service, and many of us returned home to break Shabbat and check the news, text loved ones. I checked in with my family. My brother and sister-in-law have lived in Israel for 35 years and have 5 children and 2 grandchildren. My nephew was called up for reserve duty, as was my niece's husband. She went back to her intelligence unit. And all through the days and weeks that followed, it was a giant trauma response. Tears that would well up at odd times, weeping, desperately checking the news in an effort to exert some control. Every morning, checking the WhatsApp to find out news about my nephews. Pain in my heart, shortness of breath, and this was for me here in North America. This evoked every nightmare of Jewish history. They tried to destroy us, and this time neither God nor the Israel Defense Forces were there to save us. It was a shattering, massive, collective trauma. A week later, a headline crossed my newsfeed. A 6-year-old boy in suburban Chicago had been brutally stabbed to death by his family's landlord. His mother was severely injured while trying to protect him. The story was tragic, but what made it even more significant was that the boy, Wadea Al-Fayoume, was, like his mother, a member of the large Palestinian Muslim community that lives in the Chicago suburbs. While the landlord was, I hate to say it, thank God, not Jewish, the authorities treated the murder as a hate crime because it seemed that the landlord was activated in part by the Hamas pogrom. As mentioned, I live in the Chicago area in Skokie, and right away I had a clear impulse. I wanted to attend this boy's funeral. This was absolutely crystal clear to me. I had to show up. I had to show up as a Jew, as a rabbi, as an American citizen, I had to show up, and I wanted to show up. In retrospect, that impulse was probably implanted in me by the actions of my own teacher, Rabbi Avi Weiss, the head of my yeshiva on 110th Street in Manhattan at the time, who in our second week of rabbinical school on September 11th, 2001, immediately responded by taking a group of students downtown towards the towers to see how they could help. He continued going down for weeks, to minister to the wounded, the first responders, the caregivers, no matter their faith or identity. And he taught us the lesson that the most powerful gift you can give, the most powerful statement you can make, is that of your physical presence. Show up if you can. I quickly texted a friend who's the head of the Chicago Board of Rabbis and asked if she knew anything about the funeral, whether other rabbis were attending, whether we'd be welcome there. Within a few hours, we were on our way with a couple of other area rabbis. We were moving, running on adrenaline, on our instincts. And it was only then, driving on the tri-state tollway, that I experienced some fear. We're a tiny group of Jews going to what is likely to be a very charged environment, with thousands of mourners in a neighborhood full of Palestinians who were justifiably angry at Israel, at American Jewish supporters at Israel, at Zionists, and often at Jews. I started to wonder if this was a wise decision. I started to feel some fear in my body, some constriction, some Egypt. As we approached, we could tell this was a huge event. Traffic was backed up. We parked on a side street and had to walk for 10 minutes along with hundreds of others streaming towards the mosque. The mosque filled up and the crowd spilled outside into the parking lot. Thousands and thousands of people were there. As I was putting on my suit and racing out the door that morning, I had decided to grab my white yarmulke to wear. Now, normally, I only wear this yarmulke on Yom Kippur. Every other day of the year, including this one, for whatever reasons, I like to wear a black one. But something in me that day told me to wear the white one so that people would see that I was there. Again, the greatest statement is the gift of our presence, and I wanted people to know that this rabbi had shown up. As I approached the mosque, I realized that decision to make myself known, to make myself, at least in my own perception in that moment, vulnerable, was a wise one. Because people came up to me and said, "We're grateful you're here." They understood, if not everything that was going through my mind, heart, and body, at least the simple but profound gesture of my presence. When I reached the mosque, the leaders invited me to come in, and they treated me as a guest. Yes, there were also some people who gave me suspicious looks, and I did experience some fear. But many more people came to me to say thank you, to say how much they appreciated this gesture. One of those people was another educator, the head of an institution of Islamic education, who's a scholar and a wise and discerning leader. And in the weeks that followed, we managed to get together for coffee a couple of times. We gave each other our books to read and formed the basis of a nascent friendship. The friendship became strained as the war went on, and I'll be honest and say that we have not been in touch in some months. I think for him especially, the suffering in Gaza is too much for us to be able to talk about right now. In his last communication to me, he said, "What would we talk about? It would just be two men sitting together in silence." I understand, and I also hold out the faithful hope that when the hostages are released, when this war ends, when new governments are formed, and may all of those things happen right now, we can find a way to sit together both in silence and in conversation. One of my favorite lines of Mary Oliver is from her poem, Wild Geese. "Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine." As my new friend Sunitha Puri put it at this podium yesterday, all of us confront the reality of suffering. Yes, Jews with our long, long history carry within us more than our fair share of suffering. But all of us who live in human bodies, who experience human emotions, who live human lives, are bearers of human suffering, including the unprocessed, genetically encoded trauma of our ancestors. Which means all of us also have the need and the opportunity to untangle those webs of trauma, to practice awareness, to practice compassion for self and others. When we don't, we become hyper-aroused, hypersensitive, fearful, and subject to the manipulation of those who would aim to capitalize on stoking those fears. In the Hebrew Bible, the word we translate as awe is yirah. And in one of those amazing twists of language, yirah can also be translated as fear. And I think there's a lesson here. The practice of turning fear into awe is literally and figuratively the work of the heart. It requires patience, meditation, mindfulness, prayer, all those things we do to create more distance between stimulus and response as we find and reclaim our agency. These spiritual practices of the heart are, I believe, what Alexis de Tocqueville had in mind when he wrote of the habits of the heart necessary for living in this diverse democratic republic. Everyone who was born on and has journeyed to these shores, whether we are Jews or Palestinian Muslims, whether our ancestors were Scotch Presbyterians who came to Chautauqua in the 1600s, or who came here in the 1600s, or indigenous peoples who have lived here for millennia, or Venezuelan refugees who crossed the Rio Grande in the dark of night. We are all human, all created in the divine image, all holders of a piece of the sovereign power of self-government. And we are all bearers of traumas, of stories, of suffering. The path to our collective survival, to overcoming anti-Jewish hatred, racism, to overcoming all forms of oppression, that path begins and ends with the human heart. May we create for one another the space in which our hearts can be open, our hearts can be held, and our collective heart can be healed. Thank you.